Documentary style opening. I didn't marry him for love. I married him to survive the night. The gunshots stopped without warning. Not fading, not echoing away. They ended all at once. As if someone had decided there would be no more sound. The quiet that followed was worse. It wasn't relief. It wasn't safety. It was the kind of silence that settles after a verdict has already been reached. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air felt as though it was waiting for permission. By morning, I was his wife, and the person I had been before that night no longer had a place to return to. There was no announcement, no public record anyone would search for later. Just a document filed before sunrise, signed by hands that did not shake, and one that did. People would later try to describe it as sudden. They always do, because calling it sudden is easier than admitting it was deliberate. That night did not begin with violence. It began with watching. A room filled with men who said very little. A room where power didn't need to introduce itself. It was understood, felt in the way no one interrupted him, in the way every decision waited for his eyes before it moved forward. He didn't pace. He didn't threaten. He sat still, listening to things no one else could hear. Every so often, his gaze lifted. Not to the men around him, but to her. She noticed it then. The way his attention lingered without warmth, without cruelty, as if he were measuring something that had already been placed in his care. Time slowed in unfamiliar ways. Minutes stretched thin. Seconds carried weight. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city carried on. Traffic lights changed. People argued over ordinary things. Someone laughed, unaware that a life was being rearranged piece by piece a few floors above them. When the gunshots finally came, they were brief, controlled, purposeful, and then nothing. The man did not react. He didn't stand, didn't ask for confirmation, didn't look toward the door. He already knew. That was when he turned to her. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly, as though this moment had been waiting its turn. Marry me, no softness, no hesitation, no explanation. The words landed with the weight of instruction, not affection. She searched his face for something familiar. Fear, anger, regret. There was none. Only certainty. This was not a proposal. It was a solution. Outside the room, the night adjusted itself. Security shifted. Phones were silenced. Doors closed in an order that felt rehearsed. Inside, a choice was being made that no one would ever ask her to describe. Because survival does not leave room for discussion. The ring appeared without ceremony, placed in her hand like an object already accounted for. Its weight unfamiliar, its meaning unspoken. No one congratulated them. No one smiled. A witness signed. A name was added. A life was exchanged. By the time the sky began to pale, she belonged to a world that did not ask permission. A world where loyalty mattered more than intention. Where silence kept people alive. People would later assume she was lucky. They always do. They would imagine luxury, protection, status. They would never imagine the fear of realizing your safety depends entirely on a man who speaks only when necessary and never explains why. That night taught her something no one prepares you for. that love does not always arrive as warmth. Sometimes it arrives as shelter. Sometimes it arrives as a door closing behind you. And behind the stillness of that decision, something darker waited, unseen, unnamed, carefully hidden beneath order and control, something that would not reveal itself all at once. Because this story does not begin with desire. It begins with survival. And survival, once chosen, demands everything that comes after. Documentary continuation, or emotional setup before that night. Her life was small in the quietest way. Not empty, just simple. She woke up early. Not because she had to, but because she liked the stillness before the world asked anything from her. She drank her coffee slowly. Let it cool. Let the day arrive without rushing it. Her dreams were never loud, never grand. She didn't imagine wealth or power or escape. She imagined peace, a place where her phone didn't make her flinch, a future that didn't require explanation, a love that felt chosen, not forced. She avoided attention, avoided conflict. She learned early that trouble has a way of finding people who stare too long in its direction. So she looked away. She kept her head down, paid her bills on time, trusted routines more than promises. She believed for a long time that this was enough. Fear existed in her life, but it was manageable. The kind you can name. The kind that comes with missed chances and quiet disappointments. Nothing prepared her for the kind of fear that arrives without warning. The kind that changes how you breathe. That night did not feel real at first. It felt borrowed, like something happening to someone else. She kept waiting to wake up, but the walls stayed solid. The voices stayed low, and the man who would soon become her husband remained exactly where he was, watching, deciding, saying very little. She did not understand him. Not then. She only understood that he was calm in a way that frightened her, more than anger ever could. Her thoughts drifted backward, to mornings that felt safe, to problems that could be solved by time. She wondered how she had crossed into a life that did not resemble her own. She had never wanted danger, never wanted to be known, never wanted to belong to something that required guards and locked doors. And yet, here she was. Her vulnerability wasn't dramatic. It didn't show itself in tears or speeches. It lived in the way her hands stayed folded, in the way she nodded, instead of asking questions, in the way she understood, instinctively, that resistance would cost more than compliance. She was not brave. She was careful. And careful people survive by reading rooms quickly. She noticed the hierarchy without anyone explaining it. Who stood closest? Who spoke last? Who did not need to speak at all? The man who would claim her future did not look at her like an object, nor like a prize. He looked at her like responsibility. That unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She thought of all the things she had wanted from life. None of them resembled this. She never imagined love would come wrapped in fear. Never imagined safety would require surrender. Never imagined a ring could feel heavier than chains. And yet, even then, something confused her. He never touched her without permission, never raised his voice, never used threats. His restraint felt intentional, measured. That made everything harder to understand, because monsters are easier to recognize. Men who follow rules are not. As the hours passed, uncertainty replaced shock. Not panic, certainty. The kind that asks quiet questions you don't want answers to. What happens after tonight? Who am I when this ends? If it ever ends. And what does it mean to belong to a man I don't know? She realized, then, how fragile her old life had been. How easily it had slipped away. Not stolen. Not destroyed. Just replaced. This was not the story she would have chosen. But it was the story unfolding around her, whether she was ready or not. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the silence, beneath the decision she had already made, a different question waited. Not about escape, not about survival, but about what it would cost to remain human in a world that demanded loyalty before love and obedience before trust. That question would follow her long after the night ended. Documentary continuation or introducing him, he was not what she expected. There was no shouting, no display meant to impress, no performance of power. Power simply existed around him. It showed in the way rooms adjusted when he entered, in the way conversations shortened, in the way decisions paused until he acknowledged them. He did not demand attention. It found him on its own. To others, he was feared, not because he was loud, but because he was consistent, because he never acted without reason, because once he decided, the outcome did not change. To her, he was harder to define. He kept his distance. Not cold, not cruel, intentional. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried no urgency, no anger, no need to convince. He didn't explain himself. Not to her, not to anyone. That unsettled her more than threats would have. She waited for intimidation that never came, for warnings that stayed unspoken, for rules that were never listed, yet somehow always clear. He never told her she was trapped. He never said she owed him. He simply behaved as though her safety was now part of his responsibility. That was the contradiction she couldn't resolve. Men like him were supposed to be obvious, sharp-edged, unforgiving. Instead, he was quiet in a way that demanded attention. She noticed the details, how he positioned himself between her and open doors, how he listened without interrupting, how he noticed things others missed. A pause in her step, a change in her breathing, the way her gaze lingered too long on exits. He never commented on it, but he adjusted. That frightened her and calmed her. Fear and safety sat side by side, impossible to separate. She could not tell if she was being protected or observed. He never touched her unless necessary, never invaded her space without warning. When others looked at her, he noticed. When voices rose, he ended conversations without raising his own. Still, he offered no comfort, no reassurance, no promises. He watched more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it was never to soften the truth, only to state it. She tried to understand him through small moments. The way he stood still when everyone else moved. The way his eyes tracked rooms instead of faces. The way silence seemed to obey him. She wondered how long it took a man to become like that. What he had given up to gain this control. She wondered what it cost him to keep everything contained. He was distant, but not absent. Present, but unreachable. She realized then that he lived behind walls even higher than the ones surrounding her now. Others followed him out of fear. She followed him out of necessity. And somewhere between those two truths, tension settled. Because she felt safer standing near him than she did anywhere else in that world. And that realization frightened her most of all. She told herself it was temporary, a reaction to shock, to circumstance. But curiosity crept in quietly. Why her? Why this restraint? Why a marriage instead of confinement? He never answered those questions. He only ensured she slept behind locked doors that opened for him alone. Ensured no one spoke to her without permission. Ensured her name carried weight before she ever learned how to use it. She began to understand something important. He did not rule through chaos. He ruled through order. And she had been placed inside that order. Not as decoration, but as something that mattered. That understanding changed how she looked at him. Not with trust, not with affection, but with awareness. This was a man who did not need to threaten. A man whose silence carried more meaning than promises ever could. And as days passed, fear slowly tangled with curiosity, because the most dangerous thing about him was not what he could do. It was the possibility that he already cared, and had chosen not to say it. Documentary, continuation, or slow burn tension. They did not talk about what had happened. Not that night. Not the mornings after. Silence became the language they shared. She was trapped in his world, but not in the way people imagine. There were no locked chains, no shouted orders, just doors that opened only one way, just choices that had already been made before she knew she needed them. Her days grew unfamiliar. Rooms too large, hallways too quiet. People who watched her carefully, as if she were both fragile and important. She learned quickly where she could go, where she couldn't, which spaces belonged to him, and which now belonged to her because he had allowed it. He never explained the rules. She learned them by watching what others feared, and he was trapped too. Though no one spoke of that, he could not leave his name behind, could not soften his voice without consequence, could not choose freely without someone counting the cost. His reputation followed him everywhere, sat beside him at tables, stood behind him in rooms. She noticed how others flinched at his silence, how they mistook restraint for threat. She wondered if anyone had ever asked him who he wanted to be. Instead of who he was required to be, they existed near each other, rarely together. He passed her in hallways, paused just long enough to make sure she was there, then continued on, carrying the weight of a world that did not forgive mistakes. At night, she lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds, footsteps, low voices, doors opening and closing with careful timing. She wondered if he slept at all. When they did speak, it was brief, necessary. Eat. You're safe. Stay here. 3 words, at most. Never more. She wanted to ask him why. Why her life had been spared. Why marriage had been the answer. But questions felt dangerous. Not because he would punish them, but because answers might. She realized then that neither of them had chosen this connection. It had been forced by circumstance, by timing, by a moment that allowed no alternatives. And yet, something uncomfortable began to grow in the spaces between them. Not desire, not trust, awareness. She became aware of his presence, even when he wasn't in the room. aware of how the house quieted when he returned, aware of how her body relaxed without permission. He became aware of her habits, when she skipped meals, when she stayed awake too late, when her fear returned in subtle ways. He never commented. He adjusted the world around her instead. Lights left on, noise reduced, schedules shifted, care disguised as control, control disguised as care. That was the tension. She wanted freedom. He needed order. She wanted answers. He survived by withholding them. Some nights, they sat in the same room without speaking. Opposite sides, distance, carefully maintained. She could feel his attention without seeing it. A quiet watchfulness that never crossed into intrusion. She hated that it comforted her, because comfort felt like betrayal to the life she had lost. He hated that she affected him, because attachment was a liability he could not afford. Their silence grew heavy with things unsaid. Regret, curiosity, a growing question neither of them voiced. What happens when survival turns into something else? He caught her looking at him once, not staring, just noticing. He did not look away. For a moment, the room held its breath. Nothing happened, and yet everything shifted. That was the danger. Not the world outside, not the enemies no one named. The danger was the space growing between fear and familiarity, a space where feelings begin before permission is given. She told herself she was imagining it. That gratitude could feel like attachment. That safety could feel like affection. He told himself distance would solve it. That silence would keep things contained. That restraint had always worked before. But silence does not erase tension. It sharpens it. And in that quiet, slow burn space where neither could leave and neither could speak freely, something fragile and complicated began to form. Not love. Not yet. But the awareness that this connection, unwanted as it was, had already changed them both. Documentary, continuation, or romantic tension without romance. He stood close, but never crossed the line. That became the pattern. Always near enough to notice. Never near enough to touch. She learned the shape of his presence without looking at him. The weight of the room changed when he entered. Air shifted. Conversations softened. And still, distance remained. They shared spaces, not moments. Rooms, not conversations. Time, but not intention. Unspoken care lived in details no one else would notice. A chair pulled back before she reached it. A meeting delayed because she hadn't eaten. A car repositioned so she never stepped into traffic first. He never acknowledged these things, never waited for gratitude. He acted as if this level of attention was nothing, as if noticing her had always been part of his routine. That unsettled her, because care, when unnamed, becomes confusing, and confusion invites hope. She caught herself listening for his footsteps, recognizing them without trying, counting the seconds between his arrivals and departures. She hated that she noticed, hated that her body reacted before her mind could stop it. Some nights, they sat in the same room again, not facing each other, never touching, a table between them, a lamp casting light that refused to soften the distance. He read documents. She pretended to. Neither absorbed a word. The space between them felt deliberate, measured, maintained with discipline. And yet, it trembled because he leaned forward once, just slightly, enough that she felt it, because she inhaled at the same moment he paused, because silence, when shared, grows louder with every second. She waited for words that never came, an explanation, a reason, anything that would tell her this wasn't happening in her head. But he remained quiet, careful. He had learned long ago that words create expectations, and expectations create weakness. She had learned that waiting can feel like hope until it becomes habit. They're almost moments, multiplied, a hand hovering, then retreating, eyes meeting, then breaking away, questions forming, then dissolving. He watched her when he thought she wasn't aware, not hungrily, not possessively, as if memorizing. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A liability, a responsibility, a mistake he was managing carefully. She wondered if anyone had ever waited for him the way she was waiting now, quietly, without asking for more. And still, nothing happened. No declarations, no confessions, no crossing of lines. That restraint was both protection and punishment, because every day that passed made the question heavier. Was this becoming something real? Or was it simply proximity masquerading as meaning? He was trapped by his reputation. Every move evaluated, every emotion monitored. She was trapped by her circumstances, dependent on a man who refused to let her understand him. Neither could step forward without risking everything. Neither could step back without losing what little peace they had found. So they stayed, close, distant, connected, without permission. She began to realize that love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides in caution. Sometimes it is the choice not to touch, when touching would be easy. And that terrified her, because love that never speaks can disappear without warning. And as days blurred into weeks, viewers are left with the same question she carried into every quiet night. Will this turn into love? Or will it end the way so many silent stories do? Unfinished. Documentary continuation, or misunderstanding, and emotional distance. The distance between them did not arrive suddenly. It formed quietly, piece by piece, moment by moment. She began to believe she was replaceable, not because he said it, because he never said otherwise. In his world, people came and went without explanation. Names changed. Faces disappeared. She watched it happen around her and wondered how long before she blended into the background the same way. She told herself the marriage was a transaction, a solution to a problem that no longer existed. And once the problem was gone, so would she be. That belief settled into her chest slowly, like something heavy choosing to stay. He, meanwhile, believed distance was the only thing keeping her alive. He had learned early that proximity invites danger, that people close to him paid the highest price. That attachment was an open door enemies waited to walk through. So he stepped back, not because he didn't care, because he cared too much to risk it. He reduced his presence, shortened conversations further, let others handle what he once handled himself. To her, it felt like abandonment. To him, it felt like protection. and neither of them said a word about it. A message was sent one afternoon, brief, carefully worded, a warning, a request to stay inside, to avoid a specific place. It never reached her. No one could say where it went. No one admitted fault. She went out anyway, not out of rebellion, out of exhaustion, out of the quiet need to feel like herself again. When he discovered she had left, fear arrived before anger. Sharp, immediate, but fear has a way of disguising itself. By the time he found her safe, his voice was cold, controlled, distant. He did not ask if she was afraid. He did not explain why he had warned her. He simply told her not to do it again. She heard only what he didn't say, that her safety was an inconvenience, that her presence required management, that she mattered only when she disrupted order. Silence followed. Days passed without shared rooms, without quiet watching, without almost moments. Waiting replaced awareness. She waited for him to come back into her space. Waited for an explanation. Waited for proof that she wasn't temporary. He waited for her to understand what he could not say aloud. Waited for time to make distance feel normal again. Waited for the danger to pass. Neither waited in the same direction. She began to pull away emotionally, spoke less, asked nothing. He noticed immediately and told himself it was better this way, because care, when noticed, becomes expectation, and expectation becomes vulnerability. Their silence grew different. He interpreted her quiet as relief. She interpreted his as rejection. Almost moments disappeared. Unspoken care went unnoticed, and the thought settled in both of them, uninvited and unwelcome. Maybe this was ending. She told herself she should be grateful that survival had been the agreement from the beginning, that she had never been promised more. But hearts do not listen to logic. They remember waiting. They remember almost. They remember what was never said. He stood in rooms where she no longer lingered, noticed the absence immediately, and still he did nothing, because stepping forward felt more dangerous than letting go. This was the moment viewers choose sides. Some will believe she should have asked. Others will believe he should have spoken. But the truth lived in the silence between them. Two people protecting themselves in opposite directions. Two people waiting for words that felt too risky to release. And somewhere beneath the waiting, beneath the silence, beneath the unspoken care, the fear crept in that whatever this had been, whatever it could have become, might already be slipping into the place where stories go, when no one is brave enough to speak. And if either of them waited any longer, it might already be too late. Documentary continuation, or the night everything changes. The night everything changed did not announce itself. There were no raised voices, no alarms, no urgency in the air. At first, it felt like any other night built on routine. She was reading when the lights dimmed, not enough to panic, just enough to notice. A pause in the house's rhythm, a delay that felt unfamiliar. She looked up instinctively. That was when fear arrived. Not sharp, not loud, heavy. It settled into her chest without explanation, the way it does when your body understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Somewhere else in the building, a conversation ended too abruptly. Footsteps changed direction. A door closed that usually stayed open. She didn't know it yet, but something had already gone wrong. Inside his world, betrayal rarely arrived from the outside. It came quietly, from people who had learned the rules well enough to break them without being noticed. That night, someone crossed a line they believed he would never see. A deal shifted. A name was spoken where it shouldn't have been. Her name. She became collateral without ever stepping into danger herself. He learned of it too late to prevent it quietly. For the first time since she had known him, control slipped. Not in anger, in urgency. He moved faster than usual, spoke more than he ever had. Orders were given, not harshly, but clearly, and still, it wasn't enough. She sensed it before anyone told her. The way the air felt charged. The way eyes lingered on her, longer than they should have. Fear peaked not because something had happened, but because something could. She realized then how fragile her safety had always been, how dependent it was on silence holding. When he finally came to her, he did not stand at a distance. For the first time, he closed the space between them without hesitation. "Stay with me," he said. Not a command, not a rule, a request. Her heart stuttered. This was new. He did not explain the threat, did not name the betrayal, but his restraint was gone. He stayed close, too close to ignore, close enough that she could feel the tension in his stillness. She understood then that whatever he had been protecting her from, it was no longer theoretical. That was when the truth surfaced, quietly, painfully. Silence had never been protection. It had been delay. He had believed that keeping her at a distance would keep her invisible, that withholding emotion would keep her safe. But someone else had noticed anyway. Someone else had decided she mattered. And that realization broke something in him. Because fear is manageable when it's yours alone. But fear for someone else demands action. He watched her closely now. Not as responsibility, not as obligation, as someone who could be lost. She saw it in his eyes before he ever said a word. The restraint, the control, the careful distance he had maintained for so long. It fractured, not completely, but enough. "I should have told you," he said finally. The words were quiet, almost unrecognizable coming from him. She waited, her breath shallow. "Told me what? That I mattered? That I was never disposable?" But he didn't finish the thought, because saying it out loud would mean admitting how close he had come to losing her without ever having her at all. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did he. They stayed in the same room, closer than they had ever been, not touching, not speaking much. But the distance between them was gone. Fear had stripped it away, and in its place stood something raw and undeniable. He could no longer pretend silence was enough. She could no longer pretend this connection was imaginary. This was the turning point. Not because danger arrived, but because avoidance failed. And when morning came, both of them understood something had shifted permanently. Whatever this was between them, whatever it had almost been, it could no longer survive unspoken. Documentary continuation, or the marriage proposal morning, did not bring relief. It brought clarity, the kind that settles after a long night, when fear has already done its damage, and left truth behind in its place. He stood by the window, watching a city that had already adjusted to whatever had happened overnight. Traffic moved. Lights blinked on and off. People lived. Inside the room, nothing felt ordinary anymore. She sat quietly, hands folded the way she always did when she was trying to stay calm, trying not to ask questions that could change everything. He did not turn toward her immediately. He needed the silence first, needed to finish deciding what could no longer be delayed. When he finally spoke, it was not with softness, not with ceremony, with resolve. This can't continue the way it is. She felt her chest tighten. She had been preparing herself for this moment for days, for distance, for removal, for being sent away once she had become inconvenient. He continued, before she could respond. They know you exist. That was all he said, and it was enough. Her breath caught. Fear returned. Sharper this time. Clearer. She understood immediately what that meant in his world. Visibility was danger. Being known was risk. Being connected was leverage. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Instead, he turned to face her fully. Something he rarely did when speaking about anything important. This is the only way, he said. He did not ask her what she wanted. Not because he didn't care, because there was no safer alternative to offer. He explained it plainly. No drama, no reassurance dressed up as hope. A marriage would make her untouchable, publicly acknowledged, legally bound, protected by the same rules that governed him. Loyalty would no longer be assumed. It would be declared. This wasn't about affection. It wasn't about appearances. It was about survival. She listened without interrupting. This wasn't a proposal. It was a shield. He wasn't offering her a future she had dreamed of. He was offering her a future at all. She searched his face for hesitation, for doubt. There was none. Only something heavier. Responsibility, fear, trust. He was putting his name between her and danger, his reputation, his life. She realized then that this decision cost him too. A public declaration would change how people looked at her and how they challenged him. It would tie her permanently to a world she had never chosen. But it would also mean this. No one would ever question whether she mattered again. She asked only one thing. If I say yes, will you tell me the truth? He didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, he said, when it's safe. That was the closest thing to a promise he knew how to give. She nodded. She said yes, not because she loved him, but because she believed him. Because in a world built on unspoken rules, his restraint had always been intentional. Because when fear arrived, he had stepped closer, not away. Because his silence had never been indifference. The ring was placed on her finger without ceremony. No witnesses this time. No signatures yet. Those would come later. This moment was private and heavy. Shock settled in slowly, not just for her, but for everyone who would soon learn that the man who never explained himself had chosen a wife. Curiosity followed immediately after. Why her? Why now? What did this mean for both of them? Even she didn't fully understand yet. All she knew was this. She had agreed to stand beside a man who had never learned how to ask, only how to protect. And in doing so, She stepped fully into a life that demanded loyalty before love, with no guarantee that love would ever come. But as he stepped back, giving her space even now, she realized something quietly unsettling. For the first time since the night everything began, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She had been chosen, not for romance, not for desire, but for something far rarer in his world: trust. Documentary continuation. Or after the wedding. Emotional shift. The wedding was nothing like she had imagined. No music, no applause, no crowd watching as she stepped forward. It was quiet, legal, necessary. Yet, in its quiet, something shifted. He softened, not dramatically, not like a man suddenly shedding his armor, but in small ways she noticed immediately. The way he held a door open for her without signaling duty. The way he paused to make sure her coat was straight before walking ahead. The way he answered her questions, short but patient, when before he might have ignored them. She began to speak more, carefully at first, tentatively, and he listened, not as someone tolerating presence, but as someone noticing it. Her voice became part of the rhythm of the house, not loud, not demanding, just there, and he adjusted. The dynamic had changed. Where fear had lived, respect now settled. Where she had once measured every word, every step, every glance, she could move without that tight rope of anxiety. She could ask. She could decide. She could exist fully and be acknowledged for it. Love didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself in sweeping gestures or poetic confessions. It arrived quietly, in consistency, in presence, in the way he never left a window open that could let danger inside, in the way she didn't have to explain herself anymore, in the mornings when he was already awake, having ensured everything was in order, in the nights when he simply sat nearby, silent, letting her feel safe without forcing conversation. Almost imperceptibly, it grew. Small moments multiplied. A shared cup of coffee before meetings. A pause in the hallway to nod at one another. The way he noticed when she was tired. The way she noticed he did too. Neither spoke of it. Neither needed to. Because trust, like love, often doesn't require words. She realized she could rest in the same room with him. Without tension. She could laugh quietly when others weren't looking. She could make choices without fearing the consequences were her life. And he realized something too. That protection doesn't require control. That care doesn't require distance. That closeness doesn't need to mean risk. They became aware of each other in ways that didn't demand declaration. A glance held a meaning that words never could. A touch on the shoulder was permission, reassurance, and presence all at once. For the first time, she began to imagine a future. Not a fantasy, not a fairy tale, but a life where fear no longer dictated every move. A life where loyalty and trust could exist side by side. And for him, she became more than responsibility. More than a name to protect, more than a problem to manage. She became the quiet certainty he had never allowed himself to hope for. Love, in their world, didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived slowly, safely, persistently, and that quiet growth was stronger than any gesture could have been. She noticed it in the way he adjusted when she entered a room. She noticed it in the small ways he anticipated her needs. She noticed it in the rare moments when his gaze lingered on her. Not with ownership, but with awareness. The bond that had begun in fear and obligation had shifted. And viewers realize here, long after the chaos of the early nights, love doesn't need to shout to matter. It doesn't need to be dramatic to last. It grows quietly, insistently, in the spaces between trust and care. And in this quiet, they both began to understand something vital. Being chosen for survival had evolved into being chosen for life. And in that evolution, the first fragile, unspoken threads of love began to take hold. Documentary continuation, or the realization. Time moved differently in their world. Not in the predictable way. Not in the measured way outside the walls of his house. Here, every day carried weight. Every glance, every pause, every almost moment shaped them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, understanding began to settle. She realized, first, it came in the quiet mornings, when she poured coffee and found it already waiting for her, just the way she liked it. When a folder she had misplaced was placed gently in front of her, without comment. When the air felt safer in his presence than it ever had without explanation. She understood, then, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. He had loved her long before he knew how to say it. Long before he understood what it meant to care for someone outside the rules he had built around himself. It wasn't romantic in the way stories usually describe love. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a spark that ignited the world. It was slower, quieter, but no less real. He realized something too. That silence had nearly cost him everything. That every day he had withheld words, every careful step he had taken to protect, had almost driven her away. He had underestimated how much being seen, truly seen, mattered. And now the truth hit him in a way he could not ignore. Love isn't always gentle. It isn't always obvious. It isn't always safe. Sometimes it's learned. Care that begins as obligation becomes understanding. Protection becomes intimacy. Observation becomes devotion. Sometimes it's late. Sometimes it arrives after nights filled with fear, after weeks of almosts, after months of silence. But late doesn't mean lost. They learned this together. She learned that his quiet attention was not indifference. It was a language she had only just begun to understand. He learned that withholding words for the sake of safety could almost destroy what mattered most. And that love, once recognized, demanded courage, not control. They watched each other now, with awareness, not distance, measured, but no longer defensive, careful, but no longer afraid. Moments that had once been tense, uncomfortable, weighted with danger, became bridges. A brush of hands while passing a folder. A glance across a room filled with silence. A quiet acknowledgement that neither needed to speak aloud to confirm presence, trust, or even affection. And in those moments, they understood the essential truth of what had brought them here. Love is not always a fairy tale. It doesn't always arrive in perfect timing or through sweeping gestures. It sometimes comes as responsibility, as protection, as restraint. It sometimes comes as survival. And yet, when it is recognized, when it is understood, it becomes everything. She understood that being chosen for survival had led to something far deeper. He understood that letting go of silence had allowed love to find its way. They were no longer just a woman and a man bound by circumstance. They were two people who had navigated fear, misunderstanding, almosts, and waiting, and arrived on the other side, aware, patient, and unafraid. The realization settled quietly, without fanfare, without words. They had found love in the gaps between fear and trust. They had found it in restraint. They had found it in survival. And though it had been late, it was not too late. Because sometimes love is like that, hidden in silence, shaped by patience, learned through mistakes, and revealed in the smallest, quietest moments. And when it finally arrives, it is impossible to deny. Documentary continuation, or ending, plus life lesson. Years later, when she looked back, she realized how fragile everything had been. The nights that had felt endless, the silence that had felt heavy, the almosts that had lingered like shadows in every room. She understood then what had carried them through it all. Love needs courage, not control. Not the kind of control that orders doors closed or dictates footsteps. Not the kind that suppresses words or decisions, but the courage to speak when fear tells you to remain quiet. The courage to step closer when distance feels safer. The courage to trust, even when everything in the world says you shouldn't. Silence, she realized, can protect or destroy. It had protected her at first, shielded her from what could have ended her life, shielded her from chaos she wasn't yet ready to face. But it had almost destroyed everything when it hid the truth that mattered most, that love had existed all along, even when it was unseen. Timing matters. She had learned that too. The right moment can be dangerous if it arrives too late. A gesture, a word, a decision, if delayed, can change everything. But honesty matters more. Even a late confession, even a quiet admission, can save what seems lost. Even a slow revelation can become the bridge between fear and connection. In the calm after the storms, she saw how far they had come. He had learned to step closer without fear. She had learned to trust without hesitation. The almosts had become certainty. The silences had become understanding. Love had arrived, slowly, quietly, imperfectly. But it had arrived. No grand speeches, no sweeping gestures, no fireworks to announce the change. Just presence, consistency, safety. And that was enough. Because sometimes the greatest victories in love are not dramatic. They are subtle, hidden in the way someone notices a cup left on the counter, in the way someone waits without interrupting, in the way someone's eyes soften, just a fraction, when you enter the room. She had survived fear. He had survived himself. Together, they had learned the quiet truth that love is as much about patience as passion, as much about understanding as desire, as much about restraint as surrender. And in the end, they understood that life, like love, is measured not in grand gestures, but in the small, persistent choices to be there, to notice, to protect, to care. And that was the lesson she carried with her always. Love is never simple. It can be dangerous, confusing, even frightening, but it is always worth the courage to claim it. As she looked at him, standing quietly across the room, steady, restrained, aware, she realized she had found love not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of trust. And sometimes she understood that is all that matters. The story ended quietly, bittersweet, reflective, but hopeful, because survival had given way to life. Fear had given way to understanding, and silence had given way to truth. And that, she knew, was the greatest love story of all. Documentary conclusion or engagement questions. And now, As the story rests in the quiet after all the tension, all the fear, all the almosts, we pause to ask the questions that linger long after the last word. Should she have said yes? Or walked away? Pause. Was he protecting her? Or protecting himself? Pause. Can love really grow from fear? Pause. These are the questions that stay with us. The ones viewers carry home. The ones that make us wonder about choices, timing, and the courage it takes to trust someone, even when the world says we shouldn't. Because sometimes the answers aren't simple. And that's what makes a story like this unforgettable. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories.